Good afternoon. Let's go ahead and start with prayer, and then we'll get into our lesson. Jesus, we thank you so much for this day that you've created. Lord, we thank you for science and how we can learn more about your creation. Help us as we learn about organisms and how they get the things that they need. And we thank you that you provide all that we need. And we thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we're on page 6, and we're going to be studying through page 9. And we're going to be talking about ecosystem, and this is that word down here. Let's say that ecosystem. An ecosystem is two parts. It consists of organisms and an environment. We'll say that again. Let's say organism and environment. Organisms, we can remember that organisms are living things. For example, you are a living thing. I'm a living thing. Plants, animals, they're all living things. They're really big living things, and there are very, very tiny things that we need a microscope in order to see. But together, organisms and environment create what we call an ecosystem. Now, organisms, they need an environment to live in. It's all the non-living things in an area. For instance, outside in a pond, you have the water, you have the soil, you have the rocks, the air, the temperature, the sunshine. That is all a part of the environment for the organism. And it's the environment that chooses the organism that lives there. So let's go ahead and read together. And as we read through this, I will explain to you about these different words and ideas in our lesson today. It says in Genesis 1:1, the Bible tells us that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. God made the earth a very wonderful place. He made it with dry land and with water. He gave it sunlight. Then he filled it with many kinds of plants and animals. Last of all, God put his people, his special creation, on earth to care for the world he had made. God created the world with both living and non-living things. Imagine you and a friend are taking a walk in a meadow. All around you are grasses and flowers. Birds fly overhead and insects may zoom by. Maybe you see a rabbit or a deer. The plants, the animals, your friend, and all of those living things are called organisms. So what do we call an organism? It is a living thing. An organism is a living thing. Apologize for that bell. Let's continue on. The meadow has also non-living things such as soil, sunlight, and all the non-living things surrounding an organism are called its environment. Non-living things include weather, air, sun, and sunlight. They also include rocks, soil, and water, and even the buildings, sidewalks, and roads in a town or city. So maybe at this time you can pause your video and get a notebook out, and you can make a list of some organisms and the non-living things, and you can also choose the environment or the ecosystem. I apologize. So choose the ecosystem and list some living things and non-living things in that ecosystem. So let's continue on page 7. The type of environment determines the kinds of things that can live there. Most cactuses grow in the desert areas. They would not grow well in a wet environment, such as a pond. However, a pond is the right environment for ducks, fish, and water lilies. All the living things and non-living things in one area are known as an ecosystem. An ecosystem can be a large or it can be small. A forest is a large ecosystem. It has many kinds of living and non-living things in it. Squirrels, foxes, birds are some of its living things. Trees, bushes, and ferns are also living things. The temperature, sunlight, and soil are some of the non-living things in a forest. These non-living things determine or decide the kinds of plants and animals that can live there. A large tree and the area around it is a small ecosystem. There may be only a few kinds of plants and animals living in the ecosystem. However, even those few organisms are affected by how much sunlight and water a tree gets. So, I mentioned before that an ecosystem, you have organisms, living things, and your environment, which are the non-living things, and they work together, they live together to meet the organism's needs. Now, the environment, even though it's non-living, it determines or chooses what organisms live there. Let me give you an example. It mentions the desert. And there are some organisms in the desert, even though most deserts are very, very hot. We can think of a cactus, okay? It does need water, but it doesn't need a lot of water. And God made that cactus just right to live in that environment, to get just the right amount of water it needs, and to store the water when it's a long time without rain. But let me give you an example. Let's say I take if I take a polar bear and I put it in the desert. Could that polar bear live in the desert? No, its body wasn't made for that environment. That environment is too hot for a polar bear, and that polar bear would die. Just the same as I could not take maybe a scorpion that lived in the desert and put it in the Arctic where it's really super cold. Its body wasn't made for that environment. That environment is too cold. So the environment chooses which organisms can live and not live there. Now, we mentioned organism, environment together make a what? An ecosystem. An ecosystem can be large and it can be very, very small. It's only the organisms and the area around it and in the environment that make an ecosystem. So it can be big or small. An example of that is a forest. A forest is usually really big, and there are many, many kinds of animals. Maybe in your notes or on a piece of paper, you can think of a forest and what kind of animals would be in that forest. For example, a fox or a rabbit or a deer. You name some organisms that would be in that forest. Now, we can also have a very small ecosystem. And it gives you an example of a tree. Think of a tree. Well, Mrs. Johnson, that's just one organism. It's a tree. But think of all the other organisms that could live in there. For example, a bird can be living in a nest. A raccoon could live in a hole that is dug out of that tree. There could be insects and bugs living throughout. There could be things living under the tree. All of that is one ecosystem, even though it's very small. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to page 8. Now, every organism has what we call basic needs. And if they don't have these basic needs, they will die. And that's all organisms. Plants, animals, people, and even those tiny little organisms you need a microscope in order to see. And those things are called basic needs. Let's read about it, and then we'll talk more about it. On page 8, please. Every organism requires certain things so that it can survive or live. These things are called needs. There are several things you need so you can live and grow. You need food to eat and water to drink. You need clothing to protect your body. You also need shelter to protect you from weather or danger. God created all living things with needs for food, water, protection. Living things can only survive in an ecosystem where their needs are met or where they can get their needs. For example, I mentioned the polar bear cannot get its needs in the desert. It has to be in an environment where they can get their needs. Food is a very important need. Animals eat plants or other animals for food. Plants use soil, air, water, and sunlight to make their own food. And we'll talk about that in chapter 3 when we talk about plants and how they make their own food. All living things also need water to survive. Some animals get water from the food that they eat. Others use natural water sources to meet their need. Most plants get their water from the soil. Protection is another need. It may be something such as claws, like on a tiger, their long claws, or teeth. They have very long, sharp teeth that a living thing uses to defend or protect themselves. Protection may also be a place that shelters an animal, like their home. Let's go ahead and talk about those things. So, we have what? In an ecosystem, organisms and an environment. And together, they make what we call an ecosystem. And the environment chooses the organism. And the organism needs 3 basic things: food, water, protection. Let's go ahead and say that again. Food, water, protection. What do they need? Again, food, water, protection. All organisms need that. And if they're in an environment where they can't get those things, they either need to move to a new environment or change what they eat. And if they don't do one of those 2 things, unfortunately, that organism will die. So food, how do they get the food that they need? How do they get the water that they need? How do they get the protection that they need? So animals, they eat other plants or other animals to meet their food, to get the food that they need. Plants, they do what we call photosynthesis, and they make food within themselves using sunlight, water, and CO2. Then we need to get water. Now some animals, they can eat certain foods, and some foods like plants have a lot of water inside, and so it gets the water that they need. But then sometimes they need to go to a lake or a stream, a river, to get the water that they need. We as humans, we can go to a water machine, or we can go to the store and buy a bottle of water that's clean. I wouldn't drink the water that comes out of the sink that needs to be clean first. But we can definitely use that water to wash ourselves, to wash our clothes, to meet other needs. Protection's another thing. How do you protect yourself? Well, one, the clothes that we wear. Our hair also protects our heads. Maybe we need to wear a hat. If it's really sunny out, we wear sun cream to protect our skin. If it's really cold, we wear an extra coat to keep our body warm. And also gloves, a scarf, and a hat. That all is a way of protecting us. Our home, whether it's an apartment or a house, is protection. We're not sleeping outside. We are in a house or an apartment where we don't get wet from the rain, or we don't get snowed on, or we stay warm from the cold. That is a way of protecting our bodies. Well, animals also need protection, and they can either dig a hole in the ground or make a nest in a tree. Those are all ways to protect themselves, not only from weather, but from other animals that might eat them. You say, well, how do plants protect themselves? Well, plants, sometimes they have stinging hairs or thorns on the outside of themselves, and animals don't eat them because it would hurt, it would be painful. Some plants have poison in it, so animals stay away from that. So there are different ways that God has made plants to protect themselves. All right, let's move on to the last page, which is page 9. All right, talking about how do animals get the things that they need, the basic needs. Anything that can meet a need of a living thing is a resource. Resources can be living or non-living things. A bear's resource can include food such as fish and berries. A cave for protection is also a resource. When living things try to use the same resource, it's called competition. Animals may compete for the resources such as food, shelter, or water. For example, black bears may eat small animals, nuts, roots, and berries. Foxes may eat insects, eggs, and berries. If black bears and foxes live in the same area and eat the same kind of berries, then we say they are competing for the berries. Most ecosystems have a limited amount of resources. Sometimes a resource runs out. When this happens, the animals that depend on the resource must adjust or they will die. To avoid death, they may change the way they meet their basic need in the ecosystem, or they may move to a new ecosystem. And that word is called migrate. We'll talk about migration in another lesson. So two bold vocabulary words we learned in here are resource and competition. Let's say those together. Resource, competition. Now, a resource is anything that can give an organism its basic need. Okay? For instance, if I want to go get some water, I can go to the water machine. That water machine is a resource of water for me. If I want to get out of the rain, I can go inside a building. That is a resource for me. If I'm cold, I can put on a sweater or a jacket. That is a resource for me. So anything that meets a basic need is called a resource. Now this word you may have heard before, competition. Competition, we think about sports when two teams are in a match together, maybe a soccer game, and they're competing to win that game. It's kind of the same thing here. It's when two organisms want the same resource, and they might have to fight over it a little bit, or maybe the larger animal will win, and the other organism will move and find a different resource or find a new environment or ecosystem to live in. Now, I mentioned before, if they are in an ecosystem that they cannot get their basic needs, they have to either change some of those basic needs or they have to move to a new ecosystem. If they don't do those two things, that organism will die. Okay, so we're at the end of this lesson. There are 2 questions on page 9 that you can do as homework. And also in your activity manual, there is page 4 that you can work on to review what we learned here today. See you next time.